And welcome. I'm Charlotte Nichols, Acting Director of the MA Program in Museum Professions. We're extremely honored to have Graham Beal, Director of the Detroit Institute of Arts, with us this evening for his talk titled The Fight to Save the Collections of the Detroit Institute of Arts, which has been generously funded by the Lehman Foundation. This event was planned by Petra Chu, who very much regrets not being here this evening. Mr. Beal is a native of Great Britain and holds degrees in English and Art History from the University of Manchester and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. He joined the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1999, where he organized many acclaimed exhibitions, including Van Gogh Face to Face, Magnificenza, the Medici, Michelangelo, and the Art of Late Renaissance Florence, and On the Edge, contemporary art from the Daimler-Chrysler collection. He also oversaw a major renovation and expansion of the original museum building. His most recent achievement has received international attention and praise and is surely destined to be the stuff of legend. Tonight we will hear about the way in which the Detroit Institute of Arts avoided the threat of deaccessioning holdings to assist the city of Detroit in paying its enormous debts. The ingenious solution to avoiding such a calamity has been called the Grand Bargain. Without further ado, Mr. Beal.
Thank you, Charlotte. What I'm going to do, because as you all know, history is prologue, is going to spend a little bit of time talking about the development and the history of the DIA, because various components of that history played into the denouement, or played into the various tactics that were deployed by both sides. The Detroit Museum of Art was founded in 1883 by, it's an absolutely textbook example of the U.S. art museum of the last quarter of the 19th century. A group of captains of industry get together because they've decided that an U.S. City, to be worth its salt, absolutely has to have an art museum, and so they use their considerable means to organize an exhibition of art that comes into a rented or hired space for quite a while, 6 months, a year, or two in some cases. And here is a depiction of the great art exhibition, actually a woodcut done by the American late 19th century Impressionist artist Gary Melchers, who came from Detroit. The theory being that this would inspire the people of the city to realize that, as we all know anyway, that you can't really live without art, and that an art museum should be established. And indeed, this Richardsonian Romanesque building opened to the public in 1887, and for the next 22 years conducted business as a private 501c3 independent, self-perpetuating organization. But throughout this period, from about 1895, the museum got serious operating support from the city of Detroit, from the tax funds from what was then a truly burgeoning city. The growth of the city of Detroit between 1890 and 1910, and then on there from on beyond, is really quite extraordinary. Exponential is the only word. From the very beginning, they were committed to contemporary art. The very first painting in the collection, number 83.1, is reading the story of Ononi by Francis Millet, an American artist who was president of the American School in Rome, and in that capacity was going backwards and forwards across the Atlantic until he took the Titanic. And the picture below is another forward-looking work by the African-American artist, sometimes based in Detroit, Duncan Robinson, a still life by an artist perhaps better known for his landscapes. But both of these works of art show the city of Detroit, however patriarchal, committed to the art of the present and committed to some form of diversity. The main founder of the museum, James Scripps, of the great publishing fortune, gave a collection of 70+ Dutch and Flemish paintings to the collection, symbolized usually by this Rubens. It's a wonderful Rubens, but there's a fair amount of studio in it. But he gave this collection of 70+ paintings that was actually valued then in 1885 as being of greater value than the cost of the building itself. So there was also an investment in old masters. He was a driving force in the museum until he was succeeded by his son-in-law, Ralph Harmon Booth. There's both the Scripps and the Booth media empires. And Ralph Harmon Booth, who you see standing there in his uniform as he went off to be ambassador to Denmark, was instrumental in the very all-important shift that occurred in 1919, because in 1916-17, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the way that the city of Detroit had been funneling support funds from tax money from the city to the Detroit Museum of Art was unconstitutional. So they put their heads together and came up with what seemed like an absolutely winning situation in 1919, which was to transfer the privately owned Detroit Museum of Art to the city of Detroit, and it became the Detroit Institute of Arts, a city department governed by a commission appointed by the mayor. In 1919, this seemed like an absolutely brilliant idea. The city was rolling in money, and they were spending it as fast as they could. He engaged. He was friends, personal friends. He was a great connoisseur himself. Personal friends with Willem von Bode. And when he asked von Bode for what we would now call a consultant to help him build the collection, von Bode recommended one of his two assistants. There was Rudolf Wittkover and Willem Valentina, and he recommended Willem Valentina to help Detroit build its collection. And so Valentina came as a consultant. He became director in 1921, in 1925. In 1922, the Van Gogh self-portrait became the first Van Gogh to enter a US public collection, and the Matisse, the window, or the Guéridon, became the first Matisse to enter a US public collection. Again, very, very forward, very forward-looking. I would have to say I was giving this similar presentation recently to an academic audience when I was told that the first Matisse to enter a US public collection was in fact the Isabella Stewart Gardner collection in 1906. I asked the interlocutor when Isabella Stewart Gardner died, and he said 1926, and I said I rest my case, because it was not a public museum until she died. Valentina was instrumental in what was regarded at the time as a revolutionary approach to art. You see the DIA, the building by Paul Cray, the Philadelphia architect, and the floor plan is from the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1929, where it was reproduced as the ideal floor plan for a modern art museum. It broke with US practice. The US museums had tended to follow the French model of paintings in one gallery, sculpture in another, sort of media by nation, but also driven by media. Whereas, I'm not sure how much you can see on this screen, but Valentina arranged these galleries so that when you walked through the galleries, you walked through the periods, you walked through time, you sort of took a walk through history with painting, sculpture, decorative arts, all of the same period in the same gallery, a kind of implicit contextualization. And the DIA was the first museum to follow this particular model. I was actually taking Pierre Rosenberg the then recently retired director of the Louvre, through the DIA, and we were discussing this, and Pierre insisted that we'd still got it wrong, that there were different cognitive processes for sculpture and painting, and that they should not be mixed up. Using private and city funds, I should say that the Van Gogh and the Matisse, if you read the label, the credit for both of those paintings is City of Detroit purchase. And you will see a similar label on the Pisano sculpture there, a similar label on the Dragon of Marduk, and on the Queen's mask of the Benin. All of this was part of the growth of the collection under Valentina, as I say, using private funds and public funds, and very broad-minded. The existence of African art in an art museum as opposed to a natural history museum was unusual for that period. And between 1921 and 1931, Booth, Valentina, and then the young Edsel Ford, who you see looking out at you here, with the wealth, transformed the DIA from a respectable Midwestern museum into one of this country's great general encyclopedic collections. There is Valentina in profile. He and Ford were instrumental in having Diego Rivera come to paint the murals in what was then the Garden Court, and now really comprises what we think of as the DIA's Mona Lisa. There you see the court itself. That was that big rectangle. There was originally a fountain in there, and there were palm trees all around. But now we have this glorious hymn to Detroit industry, which for the past years that I've been there until recently looked very elegiac. Now, with the changes that are going on in Detroit, it does somehow seem to symbolize the potential, the creativity that is latent in Detroit, and will, I think, finally being put on sure economic and somewhat social footings. What Valentina had done for the European collections, Edgar Richardson did for the American collections. Buying American art in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was something of an unusual activity, I think, for most of us today. It's hard to realize how little regarded 19th century American art was. You sort of went from great colonial art, and then you jumped all the way over to the abstract expressionists that became American art. And in the meantime, there was this interlude that was essentially ignored. And as many of you know, I'm sure that Edgar Richardson, who was an autodidact, not a scholar by training, wrote the textbook that was used in U.S. universities for American art for many decades. There's an example of the Bingham, of one of the versions of the trappers descending the Mississippi. He took over from Valentina through the 60s, and it was during his administration that the DIA received the last line item in 1952 from the city of Detroit, specifically designated to buy art. So this work that you see here is one of the last City of Detroit purchases, a wonderful African piece. Soon after, in 1969, one of the great collectors of Detroit, Robert Tannehill, a member of the Hudson department store family, left his entire collection of 550 pieces, mainly modernist art, 4 Cézannes, 4 Renoirs, 3 Van Goghs, as well as African and other pieces. Here is a marvelous little Degas from that collection. That collection came into the museum, as did the collection of Anna Thompson Dodge, who left an extraordinary group of, more than a group, a collection of mainly French 18th century material. The room that you see there is in her house on her mansion on what was Rose Terrace, which was an exact replica of the Trianon at Versailles. Fred Cummings was scholar, director, and he added his to the collection between 1973 and 83 in very many areas. There's our Gentileschi of Judith, and our great Fuseli, The Nightmare, Cotopaxi by Church, and the nail figure that represents the last gift from Eleanor Ford of $2 million in 1976 to establish a serious African collection, which interestingly was regarded as outreach to the African American, a nice try, but it wasn't really what it was all about. But many American museums were trying that ploy at that time. Subsequently, another great collector, Hawkins Ferry, of the Ferry Seed Company, left his collection of modernist art, represented by that de Kooning, and a young curator called David Penny, now at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, in 1980 began putting together an extraordinary African, Native American collection. And we have, despite all of the DIA's financial problems over the years, we're one of the richer museums when it comes to annual acquisition funds, approximately $4.5 to $5 million a year to spend on art that enables us to acquire works such as the Van Buren that you see there, that was thought to be a replica of the same painting in the Hermitage, but research has shown that they have the replica and that this is the original. But we have the ability to add to the collection very, very seriously. I went to the DI in 1999 for quite specific purposes. It was to think about how we would present the collection to a general audience rather than presenting art according to art history and connoisseurship principles, and then hoping that we could somehow translate that experience as a gateway to the general public. I'd come to the conclusion that it wasn't working very well, and there were other thoughts along those lines that you've seen manifested at the Newark Museum, for example, quite early on, and you also see happening at the British Museum under Neil McGregor. But in planning, we were doing a complete renovation, the whole collection, this huge collection, 6,000 works of art on view at any time out of 65,000, installed in 150,000 square feet of gallery spaces, 115 to 120 galleries, all had to be redone all over again. So my personal thought was, wouldn't it be great to be able to rethink this, or lead the rethinking of this with a collection that is so strong that you cannot be accused of doing anything from weakness, which is usually the critical response had been the critical response to museums when they veered away from the traditional manner of presentation. So we put together several teams drawn from across the staff, and over 18 months they worked with the curators and with the educators to draw out from the collection the stories that they found interesting, from not ideas that were illustrated by the works of art, but themes that were demonstrated by the objects themselves. And I asked them, when they worked on this project, to ask two questions. One, why does this object exist? And two, why is it in the Detroit Institute of Arts? Because the first question can be answered historically, and the second one is about aesthetic and other values. For example, briefly, this John Singleton Copley painting of a young woman called Hannah Loring. This is her wedding portrait. She married one of the individuals who owned the tea that was thrown into the bay in Boston, was on the wrong side and ended up far from that splendor in her old age in the Bermudas, but in the Bahamas. Sorry, but the question: why does this object exist? It exists because it was made for a wealthy young woman at an extraordinary point in her career, Why is it in the DIA? Well, it's by John Singleton Copley, America's first great native-born genius of an artist with his extraordinary abilities with textures and that sort of thing. So those were the kinds of things that we were looking for, the way that people can connect to the experience of the human need for this particular and for other objects. The teams came up with over 300 different notions that we were whittled down to about 90, which is what you see on view at the DIA now. When we had our ideas together, we put them in front of teams of visitor groups that came back to discuss what we were doing. We didn't ask them for ideas, which was one of the rumors that got out. We tested our ideas and tested the efficacy of how we were expressing those ideas with these groups that were put together by another agency, balanced through ethnicity, age, and gender. And trying to sum up here quickly, it was the personal connections. What is it? What human need did these objects fulfill? And so it's not about style, it's not about patronage necessarily, it's about the basic, as I say, shared human experience. And you can see there on this slide here that we have the rather more elegant titles on one side, Ancestor and Spirit Forces, but what it all boils down to is the experience of family and continuity. The Grand Tour, we have a suite of galleries dedicated to the Grand Tour. It's about vacation. We all know what it's like to bring souvenirs back, and these were very elaborate and expensive souvenirs, but nevertheless, that's what the Canaletto was, that the Earl of here, there, or wherever took back to his castle in England. We're returning to Anna Thompson Dodge's collection and others. This is the installation of the 18th century French collection when I arrived, and the story that it told was that of Rococo, Baroque Rococo, neoclassicism. Extraordinary pieces. That's the great Duc d'Orléans service by Thomas Germain, the tureen there, and that extraordinary candelabra is one of two made for Catherine the Great for the great processional rooms that went through the old Hermitage. But when you ask why these objects exist, they were made for very, very wealthy people who were bored out of their skulls. They had almost nothing to do all day, and so they ritualized their whole experience. They turned getting through the day into a kind of a ceremony. And so we arranged not just French, but Italian, German, English are all put together very tastefully. But to show splendor by the hour is what we call this particular suite of galleries. And you see the levee, the party that was given when the lady got dressed, friends coming round to help pick the jewelry. You go on through the day to the great 14 or 15 course meal that very often happened in the evening. And here you see us, the preparation for one of our interactives that's in the galleries. I like to point out that we saved a lot of money on costume with just using the sleeves there. Those are members of the education department in a studio in New York filming this, because in the end all you need to see are the arms reaching. And we have 3 courses out of a 14 or 15 course meal that shows the objects on the table, to a large extent, are the objects that are around you in the gallery. So up on the top right, there is an English épingle that is featured twice in the 3 courses, and so people can see that this incredibly elaborate-looking object is in effect a lazy Susan, something that's in the middle of the table that you spin around to get to the grapes and the candy at the end of the meal. And there is our dining table with people gathered around. You sit down, push a button, and the feast begins. And some of the critics made it sound like we'd installed a pinball alley with all of these interactives, but there are only 15 of such in the 115 galleries, and you get some idea there that I don't think that the Thomas Germain Turenne is really upstaged by the table off in the corner there, surrounded by objects. We put great emphasis on the fact that we wanted to be a visitor-friendly museum, engage people, slow people down. 80% of our audience comes from 3 counties around Detroit. We're the ultimate untourist town. So if those people aren't willing to come back, we don't have an audience at all. So we have to engage. We have to engage people, and we these 2 slides, I won't go into details, but those 2 slides symbolize the old building where the balcony only went round 2 sides of the great courtyard, so you couldn't actually get from behind where that photograph is taken over to the far corner because there's no walkway there which would take you to the Rivera courtyard. So we straightened out the wayfinding, and we had all of our labels, all of our didactic material didn't so much give information as made suggestions as to what you should look for, and encourage people to talk to one another, as is exemplified in this slide here with this young man engaged with his family, talking about some wonderful French Daumier-like, unfortunately not Daumier, but Daumier-like caricature busts that we have in our collection. We also reached out to the public, taking out reproductions into the community in a program called Inside Out, installing high-quality reproductions in surprising places, such as this picture of our great Frederick Church, Syria by the Sea, showing the ruins of several civilizations in front of the, I hate this word, it's overused so much, but the icon of Detroit ruin, the great great central station, railway station. And here we are trying to get people to see themselves in the art, and I love this picture of the dog looking at a couple of dogs, but maybe you can't make it out, with the dead buck there. When we were planning all of this, it was done with great celebration and great resolve, but we knew that we were heading for a financial crisis. And so we determined that we'd lost all the city funding that had been there in 1919 had gone, all the state funding that had been there in the 1980s had gone, and to restore our business model, we had to look for tax support. And so we looked to those 3 counties, that 80%, and we asked people if they would support a tax for art. Now, this was 2010, and I think you all know what the economy was like in 2010. And the company that we hired to do the polling said, we almost couldn't take your money when you asked us, because we didn't think you needed us to tell you whether or not you could pass a tax for an art museum. But when the results came in, they did take our money. And when the results came in, they admitted to being completely astonished, because we had tremendous support in the 3 counties, enough for us to go forward with a millage. It was the beginning of the DI's deep involvement in politics in a meaningful sense, and from my point of view, completely unenjoyable. But we went forward, and in fact, we prevailed. We won the tax, and for the first time for 40 years, the DIA had financial stability for its operating budget. That was in August of 2012, and in April, a whole 8 months later, 2013, the new emergency manager of the city of Detroit declared that the art collection was in fact an asset possibly available to the creditors for the DI bankruptcy that had just been declared. Now, I put that slide up so that you can look at a lot of pictures, because it's my last slide as I talk about the proceedings of the bankruptcy. The simple fact: City of Detroit declared a bankruptcy under Chapter 9, and it differs in a couple of important aspects from Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, you can come to a settlement and you can go in front of the judge, and the judge, you can say, this is what we've worked out, and the judge can say, well, you haven't looked at such and such over there. I think you need to look at those assets and think about how you're going to realize those before I'm going to agree to any plan. The judge can do that in a bankruptcy, but he cannot order that or order liquidation, nor can the creditors order liquidation in a municipal bankruptcy of anything that is held in the public trust. Because the point of a municipal bankruptcy is not to satisfy creditors, first and foremost. It is meant to do that as much as possible. The main purpose of a municipal bankruptcy is to right the situation of the municipality and put it back on the path to stability. And settling with the creditors is part of that, but it is not the primary focus. So immediately, the focus was on, is the DIA a public trust, a formal public trust? And we had been going through our records diligently. Our lawyers had engaged individuals who were going through all of our archives and all of our files, and the only consolation we got was a compliment from the lawyers saying what great shape our files were in, which was a bit of a surprise to me. But we found no equivalent of a smoking gun that established the DIA as a public trust. So going into this with all the caution of lawyers, it was decided that we would do everything that we could that was possible as the situation developed to avoid filing suit. In the end, we were going to do whatever we could to defend the collection, as when it really did, after a few months, reach some pretty tense situation. Our main resident bankruptcy lawyer said that a rather Churchillian way, that we will defend the DI's collection work of art by work of art. It was bankruptcy was declared, but the situation was the DIA, which I need to back up here, is that I didn't work for the city of Detroit in that sense, that owns the collection and owns the building. I worked for a group called the Detroit Institute of Arts, Inc., that in 1998 had signed an operating agreement with the city of Detroit to run the museum on behalf of the city. It was the private group that had been called the Founders Society, the private support group. Many museums have them. But the collection is owned by the city of Detroit, not owned by the Detroit Institute of Arts, Inc., the 501c3 that was running the museum that I worked for, and that all of us worked for. And so when it became apparent that we were not thinking of selling any works of art and being helpful in that sense, the city of Detroit, we were in the position where we were treated as if we had no standing. In other words, the city of Detroit, the lawyers for the city of Detroit, the emergency manager, the mayor was out of the picture, the city council was out of the picture. The emergency manager working for the governor was acting as if the DIA had no standing. When I say the DIA, I mean the DIA Inc., had no standing, and they were working with the creditors completely over our heads. So we were actually reading about things in the newspaper as the sides began to align themselves. My chairman had a meeting with the chief restructuring expert, a man called Ken Buckfire, and he came out of the meeting sort of scratching his head. We sat down. I was told I was not going to be at that meeting, and he was scratching his head because he said they kept asking, what can we do for the city of Detroit? And it was so alien to us. We'd just raised $360 million over 12 years to redo the museum, and we'd just about tapped out all of our credit. And so we were thinking, well, maybe they want us to take over the underground parking lot, which needs $10 million of work to get it. We were on a completely different page, because when I did go to my one and only meeting, and my chairman's second meeting, with Mr. Buckfire and their chief lawyer, Bruce Bennett, they basically revealed that what they thought the DIA could do for the city of Detroit was for us to come up with, and this was very much the way they said, well, like, could you raise like $20 million a year for 20 years? You wouldn't have to give it all at once. And my chairman and I were sort of just sitting there thinking that this is insane. We sort of explained that we were an institution, that we raised all this money, and the museum cost $35 million a year to run, so that over 10 years we were saving the city of Detroit $350 million, and all of that didn't cut any ice. And my chairman is a very sophisticated man, a brilliant lawyer, successful businessman. So for him to sort of be puzzled was really quite something. But we were in this meeting. He explained that there was no way that we could do anything like that. And then the gloves came off, and the lawyer looked down away from us. Great, I thought, and he said, "I hate to say this," and I thought, not really. But he said, there's nothing to stop the emergency manager from firing you, seizing the DI's collection, and selling part or all of it. And I had been told that these individuals, because of the nature of their business they're in, tend to be domineering, maybe arrogant even, certainly act as if they know everything. And certainly there was a sense that I know many of you in this room will understand, that they're dealing with art museum people who do not, by definition, live in the real world. So we really, this was the whole attitude. And the Buckfire went on to say that he played golf with a vice president of Christies, and Christies had agreed to evaluate the DIA collection. This was May, the middle of May. And I forget the exact time frame. He said, and they will have the evaluation of the DIA collection to us by the end of July. And my chairman told me that my face was just a wonder to behold, because those of you who've been involved with evaluations, and a serious evaluation of a work of art, on average, takes about a day and a half of work by a serious evaluator. I worked out later that would mean that the 60,000 works of art of the DIA would take approximately 153 years to evaluate seriously. And then they basically declared that it was going to be the rich museum against the poor pensioners, because nobody cared about the creditors. They were creditors. They'd made a gamble. They'd got a high interest rate on something, and it was wrong. But people did care about the pensioners, whose funds had been just incompetent. Is I don't want to get sued, but incompetent is an understatement from the way that the pension funds had been handled. And so you had all of these people with an average income of $22,000 a year from a pension that were looking at 30-40% cuts in what they were getting because of the state of the pension. So the idea was to set up the museum so that it would be the rich museum holding out against helping these poor pensioners. And the first sign that wasn't a great strategy came when an independent organization ran a poll of City of Detroit residents, and 76% of the people polled said the DIA should not be touched, whereas 70% said the pensions should be maintained. And so the DIA, in that sense, outpolled the pensions, which caused the emergency manager's office to pull back, to tell Christies to hold up on the evaluation, and they regrouped, and it all resumed. But in the meantime, as agreed, we had decided we would do everything we could to be helpful. We would not be seen to be obstructing anyone. So we, as requested, we supplied an inventory of every work of art in the collection, which at 8-point type, the first one we said 8-point type, with just the accession number, the name of the artist, the title and date, where appropriate, of the work of art, was 1,640 pages of just the works of art. And that was when I think the enormity, and as I said, this is all speculation because we were not part of these negotiations. Things were happening all around us. Christies was appointed. It was distressing for the people at Christies, or that we know. Some of us were at graduate school with these individuals who were now coming in to evaluate the collection, basically to enable its liquidation. But in the process of this, in the process of going through this, the emergency manager's office realized what an incredible tactic it was, and so they decided they would focus only on those works of art that had City of Detroit purchase in the title. Again, this is speculation on my part. The theory, I suppose, being that if City of Detroit money paid for it in the first place, it would somehow play better with the public if that was the work of art that was liquidated. It completely ignores the public trust aspect of things, but that's the direction that they, I think, were politically going in. In the meantime, the State Attorney General, Bill Schuette, issued a 22-page opinion that overwhelmingly asserted that the DIA was a public trust and therefore could not be ordered sold by the court or the creditors to settle debts. So we had another joker on the table, because according to Michigan law, the governor is an employee of the state. The emergency manager works for the governor as an employee of the state, and according to Michigan law, an opinion issued by the Attorney General may not actually be law until it's ruled upon, but state employees have to regard it as if it were law. And so here you had the emergency manager pursuing a course of action that would be apparently against the state law. At the same time, there was a state law saying that pensions, government municipal pensions, cannot be violated, that it is a complete pledge, and that any pledge that was made has to be fulfilled. And so when I talked to, we had these wonderful meetings with our great legal team and my chairman and my colleague, the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer. We'd have all of these meetings, but because there was no precedent, to cut a long story short, we'd ask questions. Well, what about this law that says that these employees must? Well, it's never been tested. We don't know. And then, well, what about this pension law? Well, it's a constitutional issue, and that has to be. So we don't know. So I sort of joke with the lawyers that when I write my memoirs of this whole thing, the title is going to be "We Don't Know," because that was the answer that we seemed to walk away with every time as we proceeded very, very cautiously. And also, there were all these balls in the air. We were trying to get to the governor. We were hearing the whole notion, well, surely the DIA can sell a few things in the basement. This notion that our basement is full of material it makes sense. You've got 6,000 objects on view and 65,000 objects apparently in the collection. It's quite reasonable to think that a good deal of that 60,000 in the basement does have substantial value. But unfortunately, we went through the exercises to work on this, and whereas the whole collection that's on view might be worth as much as $4 billion, the likely value of all of the works of art in the basement, in our storerooms, is more like 200 to 300 million. In other words, a tenth of the 95% that's on view. But so all of this stuff was going around. We were going into confidential meetings. We were told they were confidential, only to read about them in the newspaper 1 or 2 days later as everything leaked. Because from my point of view, a lot of it was legal. In a way, I can't even say it. At the core, it was legal because it was so political. Because there were so many unknowns and so much manoeuvring going on. We, in the meantime, had started doing a lot of research in our on the staff and engaging individuals to do research, and we began to find very interesting things out about the collection. Well, some I knew. For example, the Tannehill collection that contains, as I say, has 2 Van Goghs and the Cézannes and the Renoirs, all of this highly valuable material was left to the DIA as a restricted gift, which, as you know, museums don't normally accept restricted gifts, but when somebody offers you Cézannes, Monets, Manets, Renoirs, all these kinds of things, restrictions don't matter that much. And Tannehill, in his will, said that if the DIA must never deaccession any work of art in his collection, and that if it did, the collection would be offered to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And if the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston didn't want it, it would be offered to the National Gallery. So there was very specific conditions, taking $1 billion right off the table of any notional evaluation. And these are all notional. And so we knew that going in. We knew there were some restrictions that had somehow seeped through, that the Grand Curator of Prints, Drawings and Photography had accepted a portfolio from Yusuf Kash's widow, accepting, without telling the director of the time, accepting it with restrictions. So there were little things like that. But we began to discover that our great Tintoretto ceiling painting that we have in a beautiful ceiling designed specially for it, it was given an export license by the Italian government in 1927 on condition that the work of art never leave the Detroit Institute of Arts. So there's another $2 million off the table. We discovered that City of Detroit purchase for the great Matisse. Actually, we came across a letter from the then director of the museum explaining to the Arts Commission, yes, this Matisse is kind of wild, and some people will hate it. It was painted in 1916. This is 1922. He says, but we believe the City of Detroit is interested. Many people are interested, and we need to know what is going on in Europe, at the centre of the art world. And he said, finally, I have secured complete funding from a private individual, who we presume it was Ralph Booth, who gave the money to a fund called the City of Detroit Purchase Fund, that was then used to buy the Matisse. And we came across a number of examples as we geared up to go into court to defend the collection work of art by work of art. And this situation was turned on its head after about 6 months, when we were actually going through the motions of seeing how much of $400 to $500 million we could raise if we tried, and the answer was none. Basically, no one was going to give us money to funnel to the City of Detroit, except a brilliant chief federal judge, Gerald Rosen, managed to come up with a formula that turned on its head the opposition between the museum and the pension fund, and got together a group of foundation heads, including the Ford Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and some local foundations, and asked them to contribute to a fund that would be used to repair the pension funds. At the same time, a good Republican went to the Republican governor, and the governor agreed that he would do his best to get $350 million out of the state legislature for the pension funds. The quid pro quo being that the money would go to the pension funds, and the City of Detroit would turn the museum back to the private body that was the descendant of the founders of the museum. It's called the Grand Bargain, and that is basically what happened. Suddenly, where we had twice come within minutes of filing to stop starting the aggressive, antagonistic process of the law procedure that would have probably gone all the way to the Supreme Court. Objections on both sides. Suddenly, that was taken off the table, and everything was reversed. We were suddenly in the same room, the same camp as the emergency manager. I had, and my chairman, had our first formal meeting with the emergency manager, and it was all smiles and handshakes, and everybody was set for what was a demanding journey as a legislature that was not inclined to hand money out in any sizable amounts, plus a legislature that is from the state of Michigan and therefore historically in bitter opposition to the city of Detroit, historically going back for decades. All of those things had to be overcome. We were told that we had to raise $100 million as part of that bargain to get a fund of $800 million for the pensioners. My ever optimistic chairman said he thought we could do 50. He was comfortable with that, but 100 seemed like a bit of a stretch. But we were various things I won't go into. Because of the economic situation in Detroit had been so bad, we had not been going to corporations for support for the museum. We were, putting it very simply, we were able to go to major corporations that had not meaningfully supported the museum for 10 years and say, now is the time. This is not about Detroit. This is not about the DIA. This is about Detroit. We had one man who has great supporter of Detroit, cheerfully not given anything to the DIA really in the whole time I've been there. My chairman and I went to see him going in. I actually said, well, what do you think, Gene? We asked for 3 and hope we get 1. And he said, well, that sounds about right. And we sat down and started talking, and this man interrupted and took over the conversation. And Gene and I sat there in amazement. He said, well, I'm going to have to talk to my wife about this, but I think we can give you $10 million. And so it was that kind of thing that got us to $90 million very, very quickly. And in what's called present value, in other words, if you give me $5 million now and I put that into a fund that's intended to cover 20 years, it's actually worth $7 million because of the value of that money over time. So at $90 million, with the present value calculations, within a few months we'd raised our $100 million. It will hurt our endowment campaign. There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. But we then had to wait for the judge's ruling because the judge had to rule that this whole thing was fair, that it wasn't unfairly penalising certain sets of creditors. In the meantime, most of the creditors had seen which way the wind was blowing, and it went far enough that all of the senior people at my side of things, we were deposed by the lawyers of the creditors, the insurance companies, the banks who had, in their wisdom, lent money to Detroit, and one by one they peeled off, and until finally there was just one creditor there, and the judge, Judge Rhodes, the bankruptcy judge, basically said, he looked at the holdout and he said he'd been sending all kinds of signals about the value of the DI. He said, I think you know how I'm going to rule. I think you know that you're not going to like it. So why don't you go away and spend a week and see what you can do? And so this holdout went away for a week. After 5 business days, came back and asked for another 2 days. And at the end of those 2 days, they had settled. And so it was effectively over. And the judge just had to rule on on the fairness, and it's a wonderful. It's heartwarming to read it. It's frustratingly clear that he would have declared as a public trust if we'd gone the aggressive route. But he basically said that there is no chance of the pensioners getting money any other way than this. That the outstanding creditors have got what they needed, and that the DIA, to have sold anything from the DIA, and he went through the AMD sanctions and all these kinds of things, would have crippled the museum, and in doing so would have seriously damaged the chances of the city of Detroit recovering, because things like the DIA, he said, are crucial to the revitalization of Detroit. So much so, I wasn't in the courtroom. I was actually in the Delta Lounge waiting to fly to a conference in the Gulf State on audience enhancing when he was reading this opinion. But there were tears on the faces of some of the people on my team as the judge talked about the extraordinary value and ended up by saying that the city had determined that the collection, the museum, was crucial for the welfare, for the future of the city of Detroit, and he says the city of Detroit was right. Thank you very much. I didn't leave much time for questions, but...
Any questions?
I just have one question. First of all, of course, this story is fascinating, and I think it's going to be a bestseller once you publish it. But may I ask, is the museum now still under the company, the DIA Inc. company, or how does it work?
Yes, we are now the DIA Inc., the 501c3, is now the owner of all of the assets, the museum, the parking lot, the underground parking ramp. All of the assets in the collection was transferred in perpetuity to the private. So we've undone 95 years of history, basically. Yes.
I am wondering whether or not, because hopefully this will never happen to another museum, hopefully, I was wondering if you would suggest museums today to go and look through their collections and see if they can find those restrictions that might have gone missing or lost over time that might be important to know, like the things that you mentioned in your talk.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, it causes a little chagrin to think that we don't, as a matter of course, know that much about our collections. But on the one hand, you're talking about important pieces, but on the other hand, you're talking about 65,000 records that in theory have to be gone through. And although there was always this spectre of municipal bankruptcy and disaster out there, when people went through the files looking for information on the Matisse, they weren't looking for those restrictions. Although Hilary Sperling, in her 2-volume history of Matisse, I would say sort of pokes fun at the city of the way the DIA handled its Matisse acquisition, as making excuses for it. And I finally got her address to write to her now that I know what I'm talking about, because I can't find the reference through the footnote that she gives in her book to the particular document that she seems to be talking about. So there is an example where somebody might have come across the fact that, hey, this says City of Detroit purchase, but this guy over here is saying that he's got it fully funded from a private individual. But so those are the kinds of things that, yeah, they shouldn't really take you by surprise. But there's a lot out there. There are only about a dozen U.S. museums art museums that are owned by the City of Detroit. The most significant one of which is the Walters Museum in Baltimore, and my understanding is that my colleagues there are doing the due diligence to make sure that there is no doubt that they are a public trust, when push comes to shove. So this should not. Just as there was no precedent for anything when we went into this, the DIA is unlikely to be a precedent for any proceedings in any municipal bankruptcy in the future. But you have to worry about places like Harrisburg and Dayton, where they have similar problems, but they don't have art museum collections that they think they can try to sell.
That was actually going to be my question for you, is that the idea of having very little, if any, legal precedent. Do you think that there will be institutions who try to cite this incident as something for legal precedent in other states, since there isn't really in other places? Do you think that, say this happens in, I don't know, Chicago or something, but it's happening in Chicago, would they try to use it as precedent out of state because there isn't one?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I don't quite understand.
The legal precedent you were saying you didn't really have any within Michigan.
Right.
Do you think that other states, were this to happen, would they be able to use it as an out-of-state precedent because of the lack?
I mean, the city of Chicago has no ownership of any Chicago museum, so it's.
I was just using the city as an example. Sorry.
Then I'm sorry, I still don't quite understand.
We'll discuss it.
Okay, all right.
Now that you've saved the DIA, for which we're all very grateful on behalf of the public trust, and you mentioned retirement. In this room, there are many young individuals, emerging professionals, and the world is changing. And you have seen this, and you have seen the worst of these changes. What is your advice to these young emerging professionals? What to do, what to...
One thing that I did skip over, this was the ultimate fiduciary issue. It's not a management issue. As CEO, my COO, the CFO, we were in many, many meetings, and I don't think we said a single sentence, any of us, that changed the course of the discussion. So the real hero in the actual nitty-gritty was my chairman. I mean, he was the leader of the team, and he made all the right calls. One complicating factor that I should not have glossed over is that when we got the millage passed to save the DIA under those circumstances, the millage goes to the Detroit Institute of Arts, Inc. The millage would not have been passed if the money could find its way at all to the city of Detroit. That was perfectly clear. So when the lawyer said there's nothing to stop the emergency manager from doing whatever he wanted to do, there was. Because if to seize the collection, he would have to cancel the operating agreement, which would mean the Detroit Institute of Arts, Inc. would no longer get the millage funds, nor would the Detroit Institute of Arts, which would mean that the museum would close. Because if the millage hadn't closed, hadn't passed, we had plans to reduce the DIA to an institution that was open only at weekends, with half of the galleries open at any one time. And a museum in that condition, it would have been much easier for the emergency manager to say, see, this place is moribund. What harm could possibly be done selling a few works of art when half the galleries are closed anyway? So in that sense, the millage turned out to be a palpable factor in holding the emergency manager's hand, because a $35 million operation back on the city books was not something he wanted, and a closed museum was not something that he needed for the revival, as the judge said, for the revival of the city of Detroit. On the other hand, it was also clear to most people that although it was a tricky, risky path, it was clear that any litigation, that any attempt to sell the collection would have been litigated against by the DIA Inc. and by the great-grandson of Ralph Booth, who was ready, wealthy young man, ready to protect his great-grandfather's legacy. So that was another thing that was out there. So when the lawyer said there's nothing to stop him, there were a number of things to stop him. And the only thing I take ownership for, is creating the museum that got the millage passed, because it set up a situation where the public had demonstrated that it valued the museum, and that we could not be dismissed as an elitist organization that people didn't care about. So, to return to your question, the world I'm in is nothing like the one I have a great picture of me as an assistant curator in Sheffield, England, with hair down to my shoulder and a full beard and a tailored denim suit, sitting in an office lined with books. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be a director one day, and won't it be great? And my title was academic assistant to the director. If I put a request for that position in the budget, I would be dismissed for dereliction of duty by the trustees. It's a completely changed world, but it's still an exciting. It's still an exciting world. There's so much going on. There's so much change. The whole question of the relationship between the unique object and our virtual world. The way how these things can be used. How can we continue to? What value is there in the unique object, and the value of this kind of human creation that, generally speaking, represents most of what's good about humanity. I mean, I think that it was my passion and my colleagues' passion for the value of art that created the museum that was worth saving, and that whatever Valentina seems to have had a great time, but he had to do what he was told, basically, to a large extent by his wealthy patrons. They were the owners of the museum, and his world may look completely uncomplicated from our point of view, but I know from his diaries that that's not how he felt quite about the situation. So the world is not going to stand still, it's not going to change, but art is at the center of it, and I think that it's our job to demonstrate over and over again, however many ways we can, to our public that art is not an optional extra.
May I have a second?
Yeah.
Our colleagues from Christies, the auction house, who did the assessment, what was it like? Was there a sense of empathy? I mean, they're just doing their job in assessing the collection. Did you hold the door? Was there a sense of shared responsibility for the common good, or was it a technical transaction?
I had a painful exchange with the head of the museum program, where I tried to suggest that the best thing that Christies would do would be to not do this.
Exactly.
But it was not in her hands, and it was the same for many of the specialists. We set it up so that they came in on Mondays. They sent a squad of specialists on Mondays, and we would set up all of the works in storage that they needed to see. And I instructed the curatorial and conservation staff that they were not to fraternize with their colleagues and friends when on the days that they came in, just to keep it as clean and as separate as possible. I went down on one occasion to make sure I understood how the logistics were working, and it reached a point actually when Christies asked if we could help them explain to the emergency manager's office that it wasn't necessary to look at 900 fragments of textiles to establish that these were worth nothing to $5, because the emergency manager's office was doing due diligence, and they wanted to make sure that everything that was evaluated. But we're just running out of time. It was an absurd proposal, but it remains rather awkward. So.
Obviously, most museums don't have an acquisition budget similar to DIA, but was there any sense from other institutions, had the auction gone forward, were other museums considering trying trying to make purchases through Christie's, or were museums saying, we don't agree with what's happening to the DIA and we don't want anything to do?
No, I think as was demonstrated by the Delaware sale, that the US museums, Canadian museums, stayed away from that. I would love to have bid on that Holman Hunt painting, but we just would. And that was one we all had experts lined up, and we had a company with goes by the name of Art Vest, and he did that individual did what turned out to be the most thorough and the most convincing of the estimates of how much would be gained by selling the works of art in the DI's in the City of Detroit purchase, and he was able to show through those kind of factors that the values that were got at auction because of all those factors, because you'll be flooding the market, because significant potential buyers would stay out of it, both public and private, that you would more likely get about half what the estimates were. So, the AMD did debate a motion, a formal motion of saying that should the DIA whatever that we pledged not to buy anything, but it was decided that it was all too far off, too hypothetical. It wasn't necessary yet. Thank you again.